David Glenn Lewis left work around lunchtime on January 28, 1993, claiming he was sick. His credit card showed a purchase at a gas station later that day, and he taught a class at Amarillo College that evening. There was one more confirmed sighting of David a couple of days later, and then nothing. Over 11 years later, in October of 2004, a John Doe who was a victim of a hit-and-run outside of Yakima, Washington, was identified as David Glenn Lewis. Join us today as we discuss the mysterious circumstances surrounding the disappearance and death of this prominent Amarillo attorney. Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laureles was shot execution-style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and coworkers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcast and Justice for Leon Laureles. And now you can also find us on YouTube.
1993 was marked by the first World Trade Center bombing that killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 more. The ATF and FBI raided David Koresh's compound in Texas, leading to a 51-day siege that resulted in the deaths of 82 people. The Maastricht Treaty created the European Union, Kim Campbell became the first female Prime Minister of Canada, and Pablo Escobar was hunted down and killed in his hometown after escaping from prison. The World Wide Web made its public debut, Beavis and Butthead first aired on MTV, and mainstream hip-hop entered its golden age. The week of February 1st, 1993, Whitney Houston was at the top of the Billboard Hot 100 with I Will Always Love You, with Shy, Boyz II Men, Shanice, and Rex and Effects rounding out the top 5. Look Heart, No Hands by Randy Travis sat atop the country charts. Disney's animated classic Aladdin, starring Robin Williams, was number 1 at the box office. Robert James Waller's The Bridges of Madison County topped the New York Times bestseller list for fiction that week, and Rush Limbaugh was top of the pile for nonfiction with The Way Things Ought to Be. We've discussed Amarillo before in a previous episode, but we'll give you the basics here. Originally named Oneida, Amarillo was a key waypoint on the railroad connecting Fort Worth and Denver, which allowed it to flourish as a major cattle center in the American West. Today, it still serves as one of the largest meatpacking locations in the country. Today, Amarillo has a population of just over 202,000, while in 1993, when this occurred, the population was just under 160,000. Amarillo is much different from the rest of Texas. It's dry, arid, and surrounded by prairie. If you've been following national weather patterns recently, you'll notice that areas around Amarillo have been hit with everything from dust storms to tornadoes to blizzards to hailstorms. It's fairly isolated up in the panhandle of Texas, about halfway between Oklahoma City and Albuquerque on Interstate 40. The closest other major city in Texas is Lubbock, which is about an hour and a half to the south.
David Glenn Lewis was born on December 11th, 1953, in Borger, Texas, to parents Herschel and Esther. Borger is just northeast of Amarillo. David was a driven student, eventually graduating magna cum laude in 1975 from Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas, with a degree in political science, and then he graduated from Texas Tech Law School in 1979. I should also note that he was a quarterback for Texas Tech's football team while he was an undergrad. If you're not from Texas, or you're not familiar with college sports, that's a huge deal. He married his wife Karen in 1981, and the two had a daughter and moved to nearby Dumas, Texas. David was a hard charger who liked to have a lot of irons in the fire. Not only did he run a private law practice, but he served as an assistant county attorney in the two different counties. He was elected as a judge in Moore County in 1986, and then he tried unsuccessfully to get elected to a district court position in 1990. And at that point, David shifted gears and did private practice full-time. In addition, David taught classes at Amarillo College in the evenings. He was also a major player in the community, heavily involved in the local charities, his church, and the Boy Scouts. Things were going really well for David and his family until 1992, when he was named in a lawsuit. This lawsuit was filed against David and several other attorneys he worked with at a previous law firm, and it was a pretty straightforward malpractice suit. The prosecutor's podcast covered this case a few years ago, and they do an excellent job explaining exactly what that means because, well, they're lawyers. Basically, this is not an uncommon thing. When things don't go a client's way in court, they can sue their lawyers, even if they really didn't do anything wrong or act unprofessionally. That being said, it's still a stressor and still something that David and his former colleagues would have to navigate while dealing with life's other standard problems.
Fast forward to January of 1993. On Thursday, January 28, 1993, David left work early, saying he felt ill and needed to go home, sometime around lunch. David didn't go home, however. His wife Karen said she didn't see him the rest of the day or the next morning before she and their daughter, 10-year-old Laura, left for Dallas on a shopping trip. Dallas is about 5 hours from Amarillo, by the way. Later that afternoon, David's credit card was used to buy gas, though I don't know if it's been confirmed that he was actually the one who used the credit card. This was 1993, and security cameras weren't what they are now. Interestingly enough, David did go and teach his government class at Amarillo College that evening, and we should note that this class went to 10 p.m. Again, I need to reiterate that his wife and daughter didn't see him come home that day or that evening. The next morning, David's wife and daughter left for Dallas, and apparently did not find David's absence particularly alarming. I'm assuming that being a lawyer and a county attorney and being heavily involved in the community meant there were a lot of late nights, missed dinners, even nights on the couch at the office. David had no plans to join his wife and daughter. This was Super Bowl weekend, and his beloved Dallas Cowboys were playing, so David wanted to stay behind and watch the game from the comfort of his own living room. And the older I get, the more I understand that sentiment. Y'all go shopping, I'm going to stay behind and enjoy my mortgage.
On Friday, January 29th, a friend from David's church claims to have seen him running through the Amarillo airport in the Southwest Airlines terminal without any luggage. Now, I need to remind our younger listeners of something important here. In 1993, in most airports in the United States, You didn't need a boarding pass or ticket to go into the terminals. TSA wasn't a thing yet. So this doesn't necessarily mean that David was traveling himself. If this was, in fact, David, he could have been dropping someone off or picking someone up.
So I studied abroad my senior year in college. My parents physically walked me to the gate in August of 2001, and when I returned in December of that same year, airport security had transformed into something closer to what it is like today. I was interviewed by Dutch immigration police before I was even allowed to board the plane back home. I went through customs in Philadelphia, and the National Guard was there. It was insane. Anyway, airports in 1993 were way more relaxed than they are now.
At around 10:30 p.m. on January 29th, a police officer driving in downtown Amarillo saw a vehicle matching the description of David's vehicle parked in front of the county courthouse. The next morning, Saturday, January 30th, the car was no longer parked in front of the courthouse, and one of David's neighbors reported seeing his car in the driveway like everything was normal. There were 2 more confirmed sightings of David on Saturday. He was spotted at a local electronics store and then later at a bank where he deposited a check. Nothing about David's actions or demeanor raised any alarms at the time. These were normal Saturday errands. The only thing that got investigators' attention after the fact was that the check David deposited was in the amount of $5,000. In 2025 money, that would be closer to $11,000, so not an insignificant amount.
And I need to point out that there is a discrepancy in some of the articles we read here. In some instances, it's reported that David was seen going into the bank, and this was confirmed. I've seen other accounts that say it's unknown who deposited that check. Logically speaking, based on the information we have, I tend to think it was David who deposited that check. Remember, his family is out of town. It was 1993, so there was no using your phone to transfer money from one place to another. Unless you're doing a wire transfer, you had to physically take a check to the bank to cash it. Direct deposit had been in place for almost 20 years at that point, but that was typically for paychecks and federal payments, not other types of compensation. And it wasn't nearly as commonplace as it is today. And there was definitely no taking a picture of your check with your phone and depositing it in the bank through their app.
So one more important piece of information about Saturday, January 30th. Someone, we don't know who, purchased a ticket in David's name from Dallas to Amarillo, but there was no ticket to Dallas from Amarillo. David's wife and daughter were in Dallas that weekend, so logically you might think that maybe there was some kind of an emergency or their car broke down or something, and they needed to fly home. But that's not the case. The ticket was in David's name, and we have sightings of David and his car in Amarillo during the day. So what's with this plane ticket? It really doesn't make any sense. And then there was a second plane ticket purchased in David's name for February 1st from Los Angeles to Dallas. Like the other plane ticket, there's no information confirming whether this ticket was ever used. Who paid for the ticket? There's nothing.
Maybe that's why he was spotted in the airport on Friday. He flew to Dallas out of Amarillo on Friday, then returned Saturday morning in time to run errands. But then you have to consider the sightings of his Ford Explorer. That throws the timeline off.
It could, yes. But just about every other car on the road in 1993 was a Ford Explorer. It's very possible the Ford Explorer parked downtown on Friday night wasn't his. It's also possible that he simply returned to Amarillo from Dallas early enough in the day on Saturday that his car was parked in the driveway for the neighbor to see. It's not a long flight, an hour and change at most. David could have also taken a cab to and from the airport. This was before Uber and Lyft, so cabs were pretty much the only option unless you had a friend or family member drive you. And nobody has come forward to tell investigators that they drove David to or from the airport that weekend.
And of course, this was 1993, so I don't know if there's any way anyone can confirm he was actually aboard any of the flights at all that weekend.
I don't know. If investigators were able to confirm that information, it hasn't been made public. So our friend and fellow podcaster Robin Warder also covered this case on The Trail Went Cold about 5 years ago. And he found information that David withdrew $50 cash from his bank account to buy his daughter a basketball hoop. This was a private sale. He wasn't buying this from a store or anything. He was leaning toward purchasing the basketball hoop, but he wanted his wife's opinion first and decided to wait until she returned from Dallas. This will be important as we discuss theories later on. In any case, there are no more confirmed sightings of David on Saturday, January 30th. And so that takes us to Sunday, January 31st, Super Bowl Sunday. Like we mentioned earlier, David was pretty excited about this game. This was Dallas's first trip to the Super Bowl in 14 years, and they were playing the Buffalo Bills at the Rose Bowl.
That was the first of the four falls of Buffalo. I remember watching that game. I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio and loved the Browns, but I also loved Emmitt Smith and the Cowboys in the 90s.
On the morning of January 31st, a sheriff's deputy saw a red Ford Explorer, just like the one David Lewis's owned, parked outside the courthouse once again. This time, the deputy noticed a man matching David's description standing outside taking a picture of the vehicle from across the street. As we mentioned, David had made it clear to his friends and family that he was planning to watch the Super Bowl at home alone. Karen and Laura Lewis returned home late in the evening of the 31st to find the lights on inside the home and the TV still on. The game was long over by that point, and apparently David or someone else had recorded the game. And this part is pretty important too. Back in the early 90s, we didn't have DVR or TiVo or on-demand or streaming services. If you wanted to record something, you either had to program your VCR to record your show on tape, or you had to be physically present to hit the record button. David had not set the timer on the VCR to record the game, so he or someone else had to be there to start the recording. Karen also found laundry in the dryer, David's watch and wedding ring on the kitchen counter, and 2 fresh sandwiches in the refrigerator. Karen initially assumed that David had been called into work, and he had just recorded the game to watch later. She was not immediately concerned in any case.
The next morning, however, which was Monday, February 1st, alarm bells started ringing. Karen hadn't yet heard from David. Even if he'd stayed overnight at the office, it would have been unusual for him not to make contact with home at some point. When David missed 2 work appointments that day, Karen called the police. That was completely out of character for him. Police soon found David's vehicle parked once again at the courthouse, his keys tucked under the floor mat, and some other belongings, including his checkbook, ID, and a couple of credit cards inside the car. Upon further inspection of the home, Karen determined that the only things missing from the home were a pair of sweatpants and some sneakers. Presumably, those were the clothes David was wearing when he sat down to watch the football game. Karen suspected foul play from the start, and the police agreed, at least at first. but we'll get into that here in a few minutes. David was a lawyer, and lawyers make enemies. He'd also been a judge, and judges definitely make enemies. Karen Lewis told investigators that he'd received a number of death threats during his tenure on the bench. There was also the matter of the lawsuit we mentioned earlier in the episode, and there was a second lawsuit that David had been involved in earlier. He'd represented the defendant.
And now our story gets even stranger. First, a cab driver in Dallas told police that he'd picked up a passenger matching David Lewis's description on February 1st at a hotel and dropped him off at the DFW airport. This man seemed nervous and jumpy and pulled out a wad of $100 bills to pay his fare. And in 1993, that was the end of the story. At the time, investigators figured that David had either been abducted or he'd left voluntarily and was living a new life in Mexico or another state. But it turned out to be much stranger than that. On the evening of February 1st, 1993, a man was seen walking on the side of the road outside of Moxee, Washington, which is close to Yakima and over 1,600 miles from Amarillo, Texas. Soon after this sighting, the man was hit by a car and did not survive his injuries. The man had no identification on him, and he didn't match the description of any missing persons in the area. So his file languished in a box in a basement in Washington for 11 years, until a hard-charging Washington state trooper named Patrick Ditter read a story about unsolved missing persons cases and decided to see if he could use the internet to shed some light on local cases. With a little Googling, Detective Ditter discovered a striking resemblance between a hit-and-run John Doe from February 1993 and a David Lewis's photo that was featured on various missing persons sites in Texas. In 2004, DNA taken from the clothing the John Doe confirmed the shocking and mystifying truth. David Lewis died on the side of the road on the evening of February 1st, 1,600 miles from home.
So this answers the main question. What physically happened to David Lewis? He was hit by a car outside of a small town in Washington. But this fact creates even more questions. How did David get to Washington? Why did he go there? Why was he walking on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere?
And 32 years after David's disappearance, we have no answers. There are two main theories to work with here. First is that he was abducted or otherwise forced against his will to leave Amarillo and go to Washington. From what we can discern, David had no ties to Washington at all, let alone a small town in the sticks. So was someone trying to force him into a remote area where they thought nobody would find him? Was he taken there for some task or sinister purpose and then left to fend for himself on the side of the road? Because remember, David was named in a recent lawsuit, and he apparently had a deposition coming up soon. This was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Something like $3 million, which isn't a huge amount, but it's not a small amount either. It also involved a corporate client. My brain, that has seen too many TV shows, immediately goes to a kidnapping scenario, or a scenario where David has to travel across the country to complete some mission with a gun to his back. He'd also apparently been threatened by the plaintiff in another previous lawsuit. David had represented the defendant. But the plaintiff in that case was serving time in prison in 1993 and apparently was a nobody. He didn't have any pull outside of the prison walls to carry out some grand kidnapping conspiracy. But we honestly have no idea why he was there.
Right. He apparently left home unexpectedly. Laundry in the dryer, sandwiches in the fridge, wearing only sweats. My man was just trying to watch some football and eat a snack. He seems to be a conscientious person who paid attention to detail, so it would be odd that he would leave the lights on and leave his watch and ring on the counter unless he was in a hurry. Maybe he was lured out of the house. His car was found at the courthouse after all. Whether David drove it there himself or someone placed it there later, we don't know. It should be pointed out that county offices, including the courthouse, are typically not open on Sundays. So if David did drive his car, maybe he was meeting someone there and that's where something happened.
The problem with the kidnapping theory is that there are no signs of a struggle anywhere. The house was in order. Other than the lights and the TV being on, there were no overturned tables or holes punched in the drywall. None of the neighbors reported any disturbances. And this was a small, tight-knit community where people were in each other's business. David's car wasn't in disarray either. The keys were placed under the mat, and none of his personal effects were missing. There was no blood, no broken windows, nothing. That being said, if someone has a gun to your head or a knife to your neck, you may not fight back. You may just comply and not draw attention. The one thing that does line up with the kidnapping theory, or at least something that does relate to his work as an attorney, is that David's case file on the lawsuit he was named in disappeared at the same time he did. His wife also mentioned that he'd expressed concern that his old law firm may actually have some liability in the lawsuit. So maybe someone from the law firm had something to do with his disappearance.
Okay, now that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. So maybe there is some merit to the idea that he was forced out of his home, either through kidnapping or blackmail or threats or something similar.
And like we said earlier, law enforcement was on board with the foul play theory early on. But eventually, they started leaning towards the idea that David left voluntarily. And because David was 39 at the time of his disappearance, we also have to consider the possibility that this grown adult left on his own accord. In an article from 1993, the detective working the case, James Smith, seems pretty convinced that this was reality. Smith described David as depressed because he'd lost the district court election and because business was slow. Smith went so far in this interview as to theorize that David had run off and died of suicide, which now we know is almost certainly not the case. But remember, in 1993, investigators had no idea that David Lewis's remains were in another state.
David Lewis was a pillar of the community. And we're not saying pillars of the community don't get depressed or overwhelmed or suffer from mental illness, but there doesn't seem to be much in the way of evidence to support this. His friends and family didn't report him acting strangely or being depressed or making rash decisions or abusing drugs or alcohol, any of the normal things we usually see when someone is struggling. But the prospect of him just leaving on a whim seemed completely unthinkable to those who knew him, especially his wife. He took nothing with him, not a change of clothes, not a toothbrush, not even his driver's license. He didn't cash that $5,000 check the day before he disappeared. He deposited it in his bank account. But his checkbook was left in his car. So unless he had a secret bank account nobody has discovered, he didn't have any money when he left either. Unless he suffered some kind of psychotic break or an extreme amount of stress that pushed him to the edge, I don't see much to support the idea that he left on his own.
Right. If the information we have is correct, he was planning on buying that basketball hoop for his daughter that weekend or early in the week. His daughter was also about to celebrate her birthday, and he and Karen had been making plans to celebrate. He discussed the upcoming deposition and voiced his concerns, but he also made it clear he planned to testify. There was no indication he was going to skip out and go on the run. The marriage seemed to be okay. I know some people on message boards and comment sections seemed a little put off by the fact that Karen and Laura traveled to Dallas alone, and that David sometimes spent the night at the office. But I think we have to look at this from a perspective of a working family in 1993, before anyone had cell phones and social media and GPS trackers. We just didn't keep tabs on each other like we do now, for better or worse.
Oh yeah, I'd go on vacation with my grandma and not speak to my parents for the duration back in the 90s. I remember once I left Ohio with my grandmother, we drove to Florida, I stayed there a couple of weeks, and then I flew back and never once spoke to my parents during that time. I was just like, welp, hope my dad's at the airport in Cleveland at 4 p.m. on Tuesday. It was a different time.
Another piece of information we have is that when David's body was recovered from the side of Highway 24 in Washington, the clothes he was wearing were not his, or at least his family didn't recognize them. Karen said that the only clothes she could say for sure that were missing from the house were David's green sweats and a pair of sneakers. When he was hit in Washington, David was wearing camouflage clothing and boots.
Yeah, I usually have some kind of logical theory to explain weird things that happen in these cases, but this one is completely baffling. I don't even have a favorite theory between these two. The circumstances here are just so bizarre. I find both of them equally credible. Maybe he was involved in some kind of Netflix-worthy conspiracy.
That Netflix show, The Madness, is what came to mind when I first started looking into this story. I won't give anything away if you haven't seen it, but that's what I thought of here. Conspiracies, frame jobs, blackmail, corporate shadiness, corruption, and all of that. At the same time, depression and other mental illness can make people do strange things. Just because nobody in his circle reported any signs of depression doesn't mean he wasn't struggling. Sometimes the happiest, friendliest people you know are suffering the most under the surface. You never know what's really going on in someone's head, their home, or their relationships.
So that's where we are as of March 2025. In addition to not knowing why David disappeared and ended up in central Washington, we also don't know who killed him. He was struck on the side of Highway 24 outside of the town of Moxee at around 10:30 p.m. on the night of February 1st, 1993. Witnesses described the vehicle that hit David as a red Camaro, but we don't have any more details than that. If you have any information about David's disappearance or his death, please contact the Washington State Patrol tip line at 360-778-6663.
We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network. Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com.
Witchcraft, the occult, extremist beliefs, murder. Tune in to Rogue Darkness each Friday and join host Raven as I uncover horrific crimes, committed under the misconceptions and misunderstandings of witchcraft and other belief systems. I'll cover a wide range of crimes involving ritualistic killings and extremist beliefs to cult persuasion and supposed possession. Anything and everything that borders the line of horrifying. There's always 3 sides to a story. Side A, Side B, and then the truth. Let's uncover the truth together and explore the darkness of mankind, one crime at a time. Available wherever you get your podcast fix, simply by searching Rogue Darkness.
Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement Podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurelis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurelis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. This podcast has a bigger purpose than just providing information and entertainment. The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act is a bipartisan bill that was signed into law by Congress in 2021, and we want to see it put into action. This law establishes a systematic process for reviewing case files related to cold case murders. The focus is on providing a mechanism for the families and friends of murder victims to request a formal review of such cases. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators.